So, my name's Denise. I am from the UWM Architecture Department. I'm an undergrad. We're just doing a field study on how the Hmong people interact with each other and how the American society kind of affects and intertwines with the Hmong culture. So, what's your name?
Oh, so I'm Chia Vang. I'm a associate professor of history here at UWM.
Okay. Where were you born?
Oh, I was born in Laos and came to the U.S. when I was almost 9 years old and grew up in Minnesota.
What year were you born in?
Oh, you might know exactly. I was born in 1971, so I just had a birthday. I'm a Gemini. June 5th, 1971 is my birthday. So just turned 44, but I always think I'm 21, so.
That's good. So where did you go to school? When you first came here?
Sure. So my family, we came as part of, all the Hmong refugees after the Vietnam War. So we settled in St. Paul, Minnesota. So I went to, I was almost 9 already, so I started school in technically third grade, right? But because I had never been to school before that, we were, in third grade, but not really third grade, right?
Okay.
So while other students were already doing word problems and all kinds of school assignments, we were still learning. I say we because there were a lot of Hmong refugee children who came at the same time that I did, so we were still learning our ABCs, right? And then so we were in the regular classroom, but then sometimes they would take us out to to get additional help with English language. So I went to public school in St. Paul, Minnesota from 1980 to 1990 when I graduated from high school. And then I went to, by the time I was in middle school, so from third grade to, sixth or seventh, I was still trying to catch up, learning how to read and write, and then eventually learning, the different subjects. But it was really in about middle school, late middle school, about eighth grade was when I really felt like I was catching up. Or maybe I have caught up and I was moving ahead of some of my peers. So it took about 5 years or so to really learn enough and to be able to be competitive academically. And then I went to high school on the east side of St. Paul, and I graduated. And then I went to college. I had many options, but I went to a small liberal arts college called Gustavus Adolphus College in St. Peter, Minnesota. So I don't know if you're familiar with Minnesota at all.
Mm-hmm.
Do you ever watch Little House on the Prairie? Or do you know Little House on the Prairie? You're too young. That show was on when I was, a kid in the 1980s. Of course, reruns, right? But I would go to school every day, and I would run home after school to watch the show. And, that really helped me to learn English, right? Watching TV shows like that. But St. Peter is in southern Minnesota. So it's about an hour and a half from the Twin Cities, far enough from my family, but yet so I can stay on weekends, stay on campus, but then I could still come back whenever I need to. So I went to school there. I was a political science, international relations, and French major with women's studies minor as an undergrad, and I took French in high school. And then so I continued to learn French in college. I spent, my family didn't have very much money. We were all refugees, but we were poor financially, but we were never poor family-wise. So we had, support. And when I was a junior in college, I spent, of course, with good planning, right? I spent my whole junior year in France. So I studied at the University of Nantes. I was part of the Institute of European Studies. I spent one semester in Nantes, which is by the Atlantic Ocean, and then the other semester in Paris. So I was 20 when I was in France, and had the opportunity to visit other Hmong refugees who had settled in Europe, traveled all my vacations, went to 13 different countries when I wasn't in school. So just got on the train, toured Europe. I was really, now I teach, Asian history and transnational history. But when I was younger, when I was more your age, I was very much interested in European history and culture, political thought. I was a political science major. So I was very interested in, kind of Western civilization, the development of, European, powers, right? So that's what I was interested in. So I traveled all over, many parts of Western Europe, but then I also took the train during my spring break. I took a train ride from Paris all the way to Prague by myself. And I traveled with American students too, but for this trip I wanted to be by myself because most American students only wanted to go to the tourist attractions, right? And I wanted to kind of explore by myself and go to local neighborhoods and not just go to the main statues and museums that all tourists go to, which is very important too, right? But so I did that and traveled all over by myself. Went to from Paris to Prague, down to Hungary, Austria, all the way to northern Italy and down to southern France, and then took the train back up. On an almost 10-day trip with just a backpack, and I stayed at youth hostels, and so that's what I did as an undergrad. And then I came back to finish my 4th year at Gustavus. I graduated and I received a fellowship to study public policy and foreign policy at the University of Minnesota. So I went straight from undergrad to get my MA. And then after I got my MA in 1996, I got a job as a policy analyst. So I worked for 5 years, almost 5 years, before deciding to apply to a PhD program. So I did that, and I returned in fall 2002. I also got a full ride to get my PhD at the University of Minnesota. So from 2002 to 2006, I finished my PhD in 4 years. And then I was offered this position here at UWM as a history professor. So I've been here at UWM. I moved here in fall 2006. So this next academic year will be my going into my 10th year as a professor here.
Wow.
So there, my life in a nutshell.
You said that your parents supported you, like you had support from your family. Most Hmong people that I know, their parents are extremely protective. So how did you have to convince your parents to move away from home to go to college and everything?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because my generation of immigrant children, we are called what in immigration studies we call 1.5 generation, right? We're born abroad. We're old enough to still have one foot in our culture, right? But then we're young enough when we come to this country that we can begin school at an early early level, and then we also are more integrated too. So I have 4 brothers and 2 sisters, but my oldest sister was married when she was very young in Laos. So she's here now in the U.S., but she stayed with her husband for a very long time. So she didn't come to the U.S. until 1991, and my family came in 1980. So my siblings and I grew up in the Twin Cities. Like other Hmong families, of course we would. They were very protective of us, right? But they also had this very intense desire for education, right? They knew what education could do. They knew that even in Laos, education was only limited to people who were part of the elite, right? Or part of, wealthy families. And we were not. We were people from the rural areas. My father had gone to a village school, but he probably maybe had less than a 3rd grade education. But he knew how valuable that was, right? Because the very few people who were able to get an education, they were the ones who got government jobs. They were the ones who became, wealthy, right? But he had supported my uncle, his baby brother, to go to school. And so he was very supportive of that already. And my mother too. She never went to school. She didn't know how to write her name until she was 38 years old when she came to this country. But she learned her ABCs. In Hmong language, we use the RPA, the Romanized alphabet. So she knows how to read and write and communicate with her brothers. So she's much smarter than I am. But at any rate, so my parents, you know, they didn't go to school in this country, but they valued education. And that was more important than other things. My father he taught us our multiplication tables before we even went to school. Because he knew them, right? So at the very beginning, even though he didn't speak in English, he was able to help us with things like that. So they were very supportive. Of course, most girls my generation, I just told you how old I am, right? So most Hmong girls my generation got married very young. You know, when I was in high school, before we graduated, most girls were already married. So people supported girls, but because early marriage was so commonly practiced, if you weren't getting married as a teenager, then you were seen as someone a little bit different, right? So by the time you're 18, you're thought of as an old maid, right? So of course I was an old maid. I didn't get married till after I finished college. I thought I was pretty young, but other people wonder what's wrong with her, right? So it's not that no one wanted to marry me. It's because I didn't want to get married at that age. I had dreams and goals and other things I wanted to do. So my parents were a little bit different. I had to be really honest not with you or anybody else, but honest with myself. My younger sister also has a PhD. All of our brothers and sisters that came together with my parents, we all went to college. But only my younger sister, the boys all have college degrees, but none of them has a graduate degree. So we're the only two with, PhDs. She's in California now, and she's the director of assessment and evaluation for the St. Ramon School District. So she's in a very, very nice job there too. But at any rate, so they were like other Hmong parents, right? They feared that we would get married early. They feared that we wouldn't succeed in school. But they were very different from many of our peers. And I think about it, and my sister and I have been reflecting about this because young people ask us all the time, wait a minute, there are Hmong families that maybe one person would get a PhD, right? Or a law degree or something like that. But in your family, in your two sisters, very close in age, what happened to the two of you, and how did both of you, other girls your generation talk about getting no support from parents, getting to do no activities after school, having to just come home right after school. What happened to you guys, right? So we've been thinking, and here's where I think my parents differ from some others. First, we were good students. Okay, we were good students. We were motivated students, but that's not all we did. We weren't nerds. I played sports. My parents allowed me to play, but they allowed me because I could play, right? So I played softball. I played soccer, volleyball, tennis. I even dabbled in cheerleading one semester, and I didn't like it. I was more of a tomboy when I was younger than a cheerleader. So that, since I joined, I didn't want to just quit. So I went through one season, but I didn't really like wearing those short skirts. Anyways, so the difference with my parents is that even though they didn't go to school at the level that, maybe other parents had, they really value education, and they didn't think that only boys could succeed. So my younger sister and I were supported the same. And sometimes we think we were supported more because we actually were better students than our brothers. The good students too, they worked hard, they can support themselves now, right? No, they're not, they don't need anyone to support them. But in terms of academics, we were better students. But they always, they allowed us to participate in all kinds of extracurricular activities. As long as they were the ones coming to pick us up. We couldn't just get a ride from friends and not show up at home. So they came to pick us up, or our older brothers. And we had supported older brothers too. Both of my older brothers went to college. So by the time I went to college, we already had that experience. They both went away as well. One came to Wisconsin, one went to, Mankato. But in some ways it was kind of interesting because they didn't really believe in us in the ways in which we wanted them to. But that's not their fault, because a lot of the girls that they saw that went to college, right, after first or second year, they would get married and drop out too. So a few people stayed in college, especially if they went away. So when I wanted to go away to college, they were supportive, but they always, there's always that, we'll see if she makes it, right? But my parents were just good people who wanted so much education for their children that they didn't have in their own country. That unlike some of my girlfriends that this is stories they tell me, and I'm thankful every day that my mother was different, and my father too. When we came home, we helped out to cook and clean when we had time. So it wasn't our job as girls. See, I hear that from a lot of my friends that, because they are girls, right, when they get home, they have to cook and clean and do everything else, and then they do their homework. But for my sister and I, we came home, we did our homework, and then if we had time, we help out. That's the difference. That how my parents treated us, and just the fact that we weren't ashamed of our parents. Many of our peers were ashamed of their parents because they didn't speak English. They come to school and their teachers couldn't communicate with them, but we knew they were smart, and in fact we helped them to understand. They came to our events at school. They came to conferences. I was on the synchronized swim team too, and they would come, and sometimes we would have a show. And I tell this story to a lot of young people who ask me. My father, he didn't understand English very well. My mother understand more English than he did, but we would have a show, and then people would tell jokes, and everyone would laugh, and then they'll clap, and they're done, and then my father would clap and say, "Oh, the joke is done." but he saw people clapping, and then he said, "Oh, I have to clap." Then they're done clapping, but that's okay, because he was there and they participated, and so I think that's the difference. We worked very hard. The summers, my family farmed. We were farmers at the farmers market. My father was part of a farm training program in Minnesota, in southern Minnesota, that trained Hmong men to become farmers, to use modern technology to be, farmers and machine. So when that program, was, not running anymore, we went back to the Twin Cities, and then we farmed. We rented land. So all my summers, I never went to summer school or camps or anything. We farmed. So we worked at the farmers market. When we were old enough to work summer jobs, we would work a summer job, and then we would go help our parents at the farm after we finish our summer job. So that's the kind of experience I had growing up. We spent a lot of time together. So my brothers and sisters were very close. We didn't have some of the privileges that maybe other kids did, but we worked really hard, and that's why we decided that we didn't want to be farmers forever. So that was, I think, a motivational component for us to do well in school, so that we didn't have to work these hard, back-breaking jobs, which we loved. There are moments, there's something about, we see the joy in our parents' faces, right? In the winter months, they would be sick and tired and bored and, plump, right? But spring comes and summer, I see the joy in my parents' face, right? They're out working and sweating, and the joy of planting and seeing their crops and produce, and the pride they had in that business was really, really inspirational, even though it was hard work, right? It's really hard work. Whenever older Hmong people tell me, "Oh, you young people, you just don't know how hard we worked in Laos. We had to get up before the sun came out, and we didn't come home until the sun was already down and dark." I say, talking to the wrong person. So even though I grew up Hmong American and had this very American, teenage life, I also, my brothers and sisters, we also worked really hard as farmers. So we knew how hard life could be, and that we wanted to create options for ourselves. So there.
The reason why I'm like nodding and not saying anything is because they don't want us
I know.
interrupting them. Okay.
But that's what good interviewers do.
Okay.
I interview all the time, so I know what you're doing.
Okay.
Yeah, I hate the yep. I hate those in there. So I mean, you already erased that. So
Okay. Would you? So like. The Arab culture is like the same as you guys, so I kind of understand. But with Arab culture comes like the looking down upon girls if they're not married at a certain age. So did you have that with the Hmong community around you in Minnesota? Or?
yeah, I mean, and I do want to say that it's not in all cultures, right? In all groups of people, there's no. Like there's very diverse opinions too. At all points in time throughout history, people like to blame Western society or Western feminism as the factor that contributes to some Hmong women becoming very progressive, right? But that's not true, because there were Hmong women doing all kinds of progressive things before they left the villages in Laos, except that it was in a different context, right? But here in the United States, it's very easy to blame other factors. But I do want to say that even the Hmong community in the United States, we're very diverse too. But I do want to say that as many cultures around the world, and even this society too, we have this perception that women have gone so far. But if you think about 40, 50 years ago, if you talk to feminists, who were working so hard before, they would tell you that in fact, we haven't come that far, right? There are so many, inequities still in terms of gender, right? But like many other cultures, Hmong culture also places greater value on boys than girls. That's a fact, right? It's a human society. It's not a Hmong problem. Sometimes young people often say, well, in Hmong culture we're this way, but I say, well, no, when you take a step back and you look at all cultures of the world, it's not a Hmong problem. It's a human society problem. So generally people do place higher values on boys than girls. So of course, I think I know that my parents would be they're so proud of my sister and I, right? We are their joy. They talk about us and our friends and family across the country or across the world, who are related to us. They claim us. We are their pride and joy, right? But I know that my family would be even more proud, or I would be proud too, if my brothers could have achieved the same educational experience, right? So I think that when I was 22 and not married, when I was 16, my father had some relatives who had a son who wanted to marry me, right? And so I said, no, not me, not right now. It's not what I want to do. But it was a common practice, right? And then I went to college, and then so when I graduated from college, people who really value education, they were so proud of my parents, right? They wanted to be like my parents. We have relatives in California. Everybody's, we want you guys just to be like their children. Everybody went to college. But then there are families who are very, for lack of a better word, traditional, right? Where gender roles are very defined for their particular family or their groups, subgroups, right? That women do these things and men do these things, and there's no in between. When you're in families like that, then some people just say, they don't say it to you, right? But you hear people say, their daughters are old and nobody wants to marry them. What's wrong with that? Or they're probably too educated, and no Hmong man wants to marry them because they can't control them, because they're smart and they won't listen to their husbands. So you hear people say funny things like that to my mother, and she'll just say, that's because your daughters aren't like that, and so that's why you're saying things like that to me. So it's these little things that you do hear people say, but now at least everybody that I know, that when I finished my PhD, my family, almost 400 people came to it, and 40 something family members came from California. Because there are other people who have received PhDs, but in my sub clan of the Vang family from our village in Laos, I'm the first one to get a PhD degree in this country. So other groups have, but not our, little family. And then I have a nephew in Sacramento who is the second one, and then my sister is the third in our family. So people are very proud. Now everybody tells their daughters, well, you have to be like Dr. Chia, and Dr. Mao is my younger sister's name. So those who used to, say things, now, they're telling their granddaughters, well, you have to be like Aunt Chia and Mao. So there.
How, when you told your parents that you wanted to do what you majored in, how was their reaction? Like, because some parents would like want you to be like a higher rank of everything. Like, my parents wanted me to be a
doctor. Yep.
But
I think many cultures of the world are like that, even in this society too. But it has changed, I think, a lot in the last few decades. But I think in a lot of Asian families in particular, and maybe other racial groups too. But I know for sure that in Asian groups, right, parents want a doctor or maybe a lawyer, right? But scientists, it's the hard science is what they want all their children to be, right? And I think all our parents have that idea too. But in American society, teachers used to be revered, but not in the same way it used to be. But in other parts of the world, teachers are very much revered. They're placed pretty high too. So I honestly didn't think, I never thought I would be a college professor. In fact, I wanted to be a lawyer. Okay, I was a political science major in college. No, in high school, civics and those, writing classes. They were my favorite, right? So I wanted to be a lawyer, and that's what I thought I wanted to be. And my parents were very supportive of that. That the idea of being a lawyer. I actually, at one point in time, wanted to be a flight attendant because I wanted to travel the world, and I thought I could do that, but I'm too short, so I couldn't do that. And my mother didn't want me to do that, so I would go to these college fairs, and I would sign up for these flight attendant, and the brochures would be sent, and she would throw them all away, so I wouldn't get them. But they supported the idea of a lawyer. But my first summer after high school, I got a job. Actually, my first job was at McDonald's when I was 16. But the summer after high school, I was really fortunate. I got this internship through my high school where I worked all summer at the St. Paul City Attorney's Office because I wanted to be a lawyer. So they have these internships where you can be in a place that's, relevant to what you want to do. I spent the whole summer working with the city attorney, and they were really nice to me. So I would spend some afternoons just observing arraignments, and people would come in, that's their first appearance at court. And then after that summer, I said, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to represent people who are guilty. I'm not, I can't do that. So I chose not to. I went to college, and I just love researching and writing. So my parents, in fact, they didn't really have that kind of limitation. My younger sister became a teacher first, a high school teacher, and so that was pretty traditional, right? But she's doing something different now. And so they didn't have, I think, unlike some other families where you had to be this or that, we kind of explored on our own, and they never told us we couldn't do certain things. The only reason we couldn't do certain things was because I hated science. It wasn't because I didn't want to be a scientist. I would love to be a scientist, but it's just not what I'm passionate about. So there.
So how was your journey going from Laos to America?
Mm-hmm.
Like, were there any like tough tasks or like things you had to maneuver through?
Mm-hmm. Well, for kids my age, I mean, I was, not so young that I don't remember anything, but young enough to remember bits and pieces, right? So my family, we didn't leave until 1979. We actually tried to leave in 1975, right after the end of the war for the people in Asia. As you probably know, the war ended for Americans in 1973, right? But it didn't end for us until 1975. So we actually were going to leave in 1975. My uncle, who was working in in Longjing, which is the CIA's secret base during the war, where Hmong people operated out of. So my uncle was there, and he learned that the country was falling apart and the leaders were leaving. He came back to the village to tell my father and the elders, and they didn't want to leave. Okay, so not all Hmong people wanted to leave the country. They didn't want to leave. They thought, oh, since the war is over, things will be fine. We'll just stay because we're not high-ranking, military officers. We're just, farmers. So they didn't want to leave. So my uncle, left by himself. So he traveled to the refugee camp by himself. But we stayed from 75 to 79 and tried to sort of rebuild our lives in our village. And in 1979, the reason why my family left in 1979 was because of the new regime. There was a lot of resistance fighters at that time. So the new regime was sporadically bombing different villages to scare people so that they would come out of the jungle. So our village was bombed. And so that was, and nobody got hurt, right? Because we were taught that as soon as you heard the noise of a plane, everybody, scurries to the jungle, right? So no one was hurt. So we had our own evacuation plan, if you want to call it. But after our village was bombed, then that was when the elders decided to leave. And I think my uncle was already here in Minnesota. Well, not right here in Milwaukee, but he was already in Minnesota in 1976. So he sent news through people who were in the refugee camp who came back to lead their family, to come and tell my parents that it was okay to try to leave the country. So when they heard news from my uncle, then the elders that bombing really was what made them decide to leave. So that's how we left. And I was pretty young, so I never claimed to remember or understand everything, because I know a lot now because I have interviewed hundreds of elders about their journeys, right? But from my own personal memory and experience, I remember very little. You're kids. Your parents are afraid, they're scared, they're tired. But you're a kid. You have your parents, and you're tired, you're hungry, and you get all these, leeches on your leg as you're traveling through the nights and the jungle. So you have all of that, right? But you're a kid, so you don't really understand the larger things. You're just told to be quiet and to just keep going. So you're tired, you're hungry, but you're not afraid. And your parents are, I'm sure they were just completely scared. But as kids, when you have both your parents and everybody's there, you don't really have that kind of fear. So I'm very fortunate. My brothers and sisters, we often tell ourselves this. We have friends who, as they escaped, who saw their whole family, killed, their parents drowned as they crossed. We grew up with a young woman we went to high school with who, whose parents were shot right in front of her, and she had to live and survive and live with her uncles for the rest of her life, right? But we never saw anyone get killed. We were tired and hungry, and like I said, had leeches crawling on our legs and blood, squirting out of our legs. But we never saw that kind of tragedy. So we were captured as we tried to escape, but we were in this town for about and I have gone back to visit that town, but of course I don't have real memories. I know that that's where it was, but I don't have real memories of exactly what it looked like, because as a kid, I just didn't have that. It's only bits and pieces. But we were in the town for about a month, and then my father hired, a driver to pick us up at different points. Many Hmong people had to escape like that, and then he drove us, and then we got closer to the river, and that's how we crossed. Like many other Hmong refugees who fled, we also crossed. Fortunately, we had a little rowboat. It even had an engine, but it was in the middle of the night, and then we got to the other side, and I think the biggest fear I remember myself, my own memory, was my family was in the boat by ourselves. Right when we crossed, my father got out first, and I don't know why he did this. We often ask him why he did this, but he carried this flint gun, right? There's no bullet, right? But he just had it with him. I suppose just to make it seem like we had a weapon, right? And right when he got out, the guides who we had already paid money to take us to the other side all had knives pointed at my father, right? And then wanted him to give him everything, all his money, or else, and then tell my mother and all of us, whatever we had, they searched us so that to give them all of our money. So everybody just like cried and told my father, just give him everything. My mom just told him, give him everything. She said that to him and Mom. And I think that's the most scary part. Like I remember, I didn't know this, but it was until later that my mother told us she carried my baby brother. I was the one who carried him from the village to the river. But when we crossed, then she carried him because I was not old enough to carry meaningful things, but not young enough to need someone else to carry me. So my job was to carry my baby brother. So that's what I did. But my mother told us later that when they told her to give all the money, before they came to her, she had some silver bars and some silver. She pushed it between her and my baby brother, his stomach, right? So that was the only money we had left to spend in the refugee camp when we got there for food. But they took everything else.
Your mom is really smart.
Yeah, that's why I told her she's smarter than everybody.
So when you came to America,
Mm-hmm. Oh no, I had a photo of a book I was gonna show you, but I don't know what happened. Oh no, then my mother's on the front page of a book they took in the refugee camp, but I don't know what I did with it. But if I find it, I'll show you.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any stories that your parents like passed down to you, like how when people have stories that like have meaning behind it?
Mm-hmm.
My dad says that you have to keep your friends really close because one day they'll like you won't see them again or something like that. And I was just wondering if your parents have anything like that, or if you have something like that.
I mean, there's so many stories and legends that parents tell us. So there's certain folk tales that they tell us that are supposed to be meaningful. I have many, probably too many to tell you now, but I mean, I couldn't recount all of it, but I think a lot of tiger stories, and because people really fear tigers, right? I mean, at the time when they were growing up, it was a real danger, and all kinds of folk tales about humans kind of turning into animals and things like that. But I think the folktale that I actually remembered the most is what my grandmother told me a story about these two brothers and how they went fishing, and then they got these two fish. Really long story, but they caught these two fish, and then when they got home, one brother was going to cook the fish, so he threw it in the fire, and then it got scratched a little bit, burned a little bit, and then the other still had his, and then they just said, oh no, let's not eat them, let's keep them, right? Let's keep them alive. And then every day when they go to the farm, these two fish would turn into beautiful girls who would cook and clean and all that. So I don't know, you may have a similar story like that. But then the you know, and then they kept wondering why every day they come home they would have food ready for them, and it was just wonderful, and they didn't know why. So one day they pretended to go fishing or farming, right? So they would leave, but in fact they were just hiding behind the bush, and then they saw that the two fish turned into these two beautiful girls, but the one that was thrown to the fire had a little, a little something that was, a facial issue, so she wasn't as beautiful. But anyways, and long story short, but in the end, one brother, they both wanted the beautiful one, and so they kind of have the tragedy with each other. So that's a story that I remember. Do you have similar stories?
No, not like that. Do you have any? Okay, so where did you meet your husband?
In college. Yep, we both went to the same college, so that's where I met him. So he's also a monk. He's from Minneapolis, but he's the same generation as I am. His family came around the same time, so yeah, it's interesting because my husband is a year younger than I am, and typically, a lot of Hmong girls. You asked about gender and marriage before. Typically, Hmong girls, my generation, their husbands are much older. At least 5, 10, some even 10 years older. And my husband and I are the same generation, and so we went to college. We have similar experiences, but most of my friends, my generation, their husbands are much older. So.
Okay. So how many kids do you have?
I have. Yep, I have 1 daughter and 2 sons. So they are busy playing baseball and soccer and everything in the summer now.
How old are you?
Actually, my daughter, both my older 2 are already in college. One's just finished his freshman year here, and the other is going to be a junior here. And then our baby is 11.
So how are they into the Hmong culture as you are, or like?
Well, that's a good question because it depends on how we think about culture, right? So culture means many different things. I mean, there's traditions, language, values, food, and all kinds of elements make up culture, right? Or ideas, ways of thinking and knowing. That's a good question because sometimes I have to kind of step back and say, what is Hmong culture that I'm really upholding to? If we think about religion, beliefs, social relations, then there are certain Hmong cultural practices that I even don't practice, right? And then if I don't practice these traditions, then my children only have access to certain practices. So I grew up, my father was a shaman, okay? So I grew up Hmong American in a shaman household. So I used to bang the gong when he had shaman ceremony. So I understand that element very, very intimately. But then when I married my husband, his family had converted to Christianity. So they went to church. So as a good Hmong wife, right, I went to church with him, and I did all the things that his family does. But when my family has religious, events, we attend. We just don't practice, right? But to us, religion is very personal, and you have to believe in it to make it work for you, right? For all religion. So, but going to help our family when they have a shaman ceremony doesn't mean that we're having a shaman ceremony. We're going there to help my mother to prepare food and things like that. And when we have events at the church, my family, even though they don't go to church, they come and enjoy the festivity with us. So so that's the kind of difference. So I think my kids are less it's not that they're not as interested, but because of our way of life, they're not as immersed in what is kind of traditional Hmong culture, right? And largely also because we have become American. We moved away from our family. Our whole extended family are, they're in the Twin Cities. So here is just my husband, me, and our 3 children. We don't have immediate family here. We have lots of friends and some distant relatives. I have my great aunt lives here, and so I have the uncles from her family, but we don't have my brothers and sisters, people that I can just drop my kids off and say, I don't need to pay you childcare. They're just gonna spend the weekend, and you don't have a choice. In Minnesota, I do, right? So it's kind of different in that way. So here, my children are, I think, they don't. Let's just take language for example. Both my husband and I are fluent in Hmong, in both dialects, White Hmong and Green Hmong. But we're also both 1.5 Hmong generation, right? So we both also speak English fluently. So we can do either. But we speak more English to our children than Hmong. So my older kids, when we lived in Minnesota, they had grandparents to be around, so they speak more Hmong. But my 11-year-old, you can yell at him in Hmong and he wouldn't be heard. My husband used to tell stories that his mother told him, right? Scary Hmong stories. And my oldest son would be so scared, he'll put the blanket over him. My baby, he's just like, whatever, because he doesn't know, he doesn't understand. So your question about whether my children are as into Hmong culture, I think largely because we ourselves have the definition of culture has changed a lot for us as a family too, and as individuals too. It's very typical for Hmong families to live closer to their family, right, if they can. But nowadays, we're all kind of driven by what's available to us, and we follow our jobs just like other Americans. And so because of our way of life, they're not able to participate in as many cultural traditions. Whenever we go to Minnesota, they'll participate, but here not so much. But we do try to make sure they speak some Hmong language. So the older 2 are doing better. My daughter's, much better. She's the oldest, so she can read and write Hmong. She took a Hmong writing class here, so she can help herself. She can speak Hmong. My oldest son's kind of, not great. He understands a lot more than he can speak. Very typical of many American-born, second generation kids. They may know a little, but he couldn't speak to someone completely in Hmong. So, yep. So the answer to your question is not as much.
Okay. Sorry, this is
That's
a
okay.
long pause. I was thinking of how in the past we went to Haifa and we went to a Hmong house, and both of them had this essence of like how they brought nature into their home. And in Haifa they have these murals that are like full of like, have you ever been there?
Yeah.
They have these murals of like the forests and everything, and then the Hmong house that we went to, it was full of like plants and
herbs, I'm sure.
We were just wondering if you had anything like that.
You should come to my house. You'll see none of that. That's why. I farmed, right? And I used to sometimes I have herbs, but the problem with me is that I can't grow any of them because we travel so much. Sometimes I'll try to have a garden. We'll be gone for 3 weeks, and I don't have a mother next door to say, can you come and water my plants? Or we don't live with our elders, right? When we first got married, we lived with my husband's parents. So, they helped us with childcare while we were in graduate school. So it's very different. So grandma had all those herbs too. So that's very typical of a certain generation of Hmong Americans. But for my generation, it's not that I don't like it. I love those herbs that grandma had, right? But grandma had to be in the house every day, and she waters them. But I'm not. And so I have tried to be as Hmong as I possibly can. But my lifestyle doesn't allow me to be able to be very, maybe when I retire, but right now my house is very plain. I'm not, I don't like all kinds of, you'll see in many Hmong house, you'll see like 18 photos of grandparents everywhere, and even maybe a picture of General Vang Pao, and if they still practice Hmong, shamanist religion, they'll have all kinds of shrine and things like that. At my mom's house, you'll see that. But my house is more like, it's just the house. I have a couple paintings, but nothing Hmong related. I have a piano in my house. It's, if you walk into my house, you wouldn't even know that my house was a Hmong house until you see my rice cooker. Then you'll say, "Oh, this is a Hmong house."
So do you cook Hmong food on a regular, or?
Yeah, we do. We do. That's one thing that we are so Hmong. My husband is so Hmong. If it were just me, I would eat differently. But my husband, he's not that old, right? We're in our early 40s, but he's so Hmong. He has to have rice every day, like many, Hmong elders. Hmong food is every day in our house. But we do eat other kinds of food too, but Hmong food regularly. So if you do come to my house, you won't know that it's a Hmong house, but when you eat with us, then you will know that we are Hmong.
That's nice.
Mm-hmm.
Hmong food's really good too.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. Yeah, so when you ask about my kids are pretty Hmong in terms of Hmong food.
That's
Yeah,
good.
they
That's part
are.
of the culture.
They are. My daughter's more of a cereal kid in the morning, but my boys, they eat like their dad. Rice with vegetable and meat, and it's got to be meat all the time.
So when we went to Haifa, one of the people there, he said, Hmong people don't have friends, they have family. So what do you think about that quote?
I mean, that's very interesting. And to some extent, it's true in a way, because especially women, when Hmong women married, they don't really have friends anymore. They only hang out with their family, their extended family, the women in their family. They don't go out with their women friends who they were friends with before. It's all family. So their friends become their sister-in-laws, their sisters, it's just women in their family. And men too, to some extent. Their friends would be their new brother-in-laws, or it'd be like the people who are related to them. People typically don't as much, right? But that's only if you live if we were in the Twin Cities, then we would interact more with just our family. But because we don't live near our family, we have more friends that are not related to us. So it depends on many different factors. So that's why I say it's partially true, but if you don't live with everybody, you have to have friends too. So many people are now not in a very traditional setting anymore. I mean, there's so many young people I know that are all over the country, the world, who are, paving their own paths in different places. So they're not able to just have friends that are related to them. So I think it's only true for a certain population in the community. But for many of us, I have very diverse friends, who are good friends who have no relations with me. And I know many other people who do too.
Okay. That's really nice though. Like you have like a broad aspect of friends.
Yeah, but it's also because of what I do and who I am as an individual. There are, if you live in the Twin Cities, right, or even here in Milwaukee too, you can do this too. There are now Hmong professionals in all sectors, right? So if you live in a large Hmong community like here in Milwaukee, the Twin Cities, or in Fresno or Sacramento, California, If you need a Hmong lawyer, you can have one. If you want to go to the Hmong store, you can. If you want a Hmong doctor, you can. If you want to go to a Hmong church, you can. If you want to go to a Hmong school, you can. A Hmong only school, you can. So you don't have to interact with anybody meaningfully outside of the Hmong community if you don't want to. That's a reality. But because of the type of work I do, I interact with all kinds of people. And I think that's just who I am as someone who lives in the United States in 2015. And, we're a pretty multicultural, society. And I think makes my life more meaningful to, have friends or to have, to interact with people from all different backgrounds. So maybe it's more of my own values than, just my racial or ethnic identity. I don't limit myself because I think life is too short,
So since you said you're really like into meeting other people and everything, would you allow your kids, I didn't phrase that right, but would you accept if one of your kids married like a non-Hmong person?
Absolutely. I think they should marry who they love and who loves them back. Hopefully they love them back. I think our community has changed a lot. I think when I was in college, when I was growing up, interracial marriage was very few, and in Laos people were pretty isolated, so there tend to be more just intra marriages. But there were a lot of Hmong people who married Lao and other ethnic groups as well, so it was taking place, maybe not as much. I think the first 2 decades our elders were very, very afraid that we would not marry Hmong people, so it wasn't very accepted. When I was growing up, it was really looked down upon, and it was if a girl married a non-Hmong person, her parents would be ashamed because they would be considered parents who couldn't control their daughters or sons. But nowadays, this generation, we have over 600 Hmong students here on this campus, as you probably already know. I see, them dating all kinds of people, all the time. And for me, as a parent, I told my kids, they just need to make sure, their racial background doesn't matter to me. It's their character and who they are as an individual. As long as they're not a druggie and they're not doing all kinds of crazy, hurtful things, and they're decent human beings. That's what I tell my kids. Then I'm okay with that. That's more important to me than their racial background.
Yeah. I know a lot of Hmong families who don't allow that, so I was just wondering what your perspective was.
Yeah, but there's a lot of people who don't allow it, but when it happens, they eventually do accept it. Let me just say one of my younger cousins, my father has 2 brothers, so my middle uncle, his daughter married a non-Hmong person. He didn't go to her wedding. He was complete because she's his only daughter, and so he imagined having a Hmong son-in-law who he can speak to, and where they don't need an interpreter, every time they meet. So of course, every Hmong father or Hmong parent or anybody's parent, would like to be able to have that, right? But now they have 2 kids. She brings the kids over. He babysits them, and I have another niece in California who was married to an African American man for a while, and they're not together anymore. So the parents help out with the kids. So I think what a lot of Hmong parents fear is that sometimes if they marry a non-Hmong person, then when there are issues, they don't have the kind of social relations that would help to mediate for them to stay together or to resolve issues. Because in the society, if people don't want to get married, then they just get a divorce, and that's what a lot of parents fear, that there's no way to have any kind of relationships with people who are not Hmong, because they're not they don't value the same kind of social relations, because we often, in many cultures too, we often talk about, you don't really just marry that person, you marry the whole family or the whole clan. So if you marry a non-Hmong person, then you're just marrying that individual if their culture is different, right? And so I think that's why a lot of Hmong parents say they don't want their kids to marry a non-Hmong person, precisely because of that. But nowadays, there's a lot of Hmong people who don't value that anyway. So even if they're Hmong, it doesn't guarantee that it'll be a better marriage. So lots of Hmong parents now, I think, have changed their perspectives a little bit. So it's inevitable. We live in this society. I mean, more here in Wisconsin, I go around the state and see a lot of interracial marriages and dating. More often than ever before. And that's because people live there. They go to school. They interact with different people, not just Hmong. And some of them live in small towns where there are no Hmong people to date. So what do you want them to do? Not date at all? So it's a very different context, I think. And it's going to just continue to, I think, be that case as people live here longer. All groups come to this place, and that's what happens to them, whether they want to or not. It's inevitable in so many ways.
What got you thinking of writing about the Hmong culture and everything?
Oh, sure.
I saw you have a couple of books and everything.
Yep, right there. Well, I told you that when I was younger, I was really interested in, because when I was your age, there was no Hmong history class that I could take, right? So anything I needed to know, wanted to know, I had to research on my own. In classes at the university, there was no such thing. And it's still the case in many places around the country, except for places like here in Milwaukee or big Hmong concentrations. So I was interested in, European history and all these other more important histories, because they are written down and they have all kinds of documentations to say how much contribution they have made to civilization, right? So that was interesting. I wanted to know all of that. And then when I was, I think in graduate school, when I began to really want to explore just the migration experiences of other people who were like me, right? I knew so much about these other people's history, right? But there was nothing about, my own history that was accessible to me. I had to go and search on my own. So I think that was when I became much more interested in, as I read more about what people have written about my people, right? The more I learned, the more I wanted to contribute to, producing knowledge about, Hmong experiences. Because there were so few Hmong people themselves writing about Hmong experiences. There were many, many other people writing about Hmong, but not Hmong people themselves. So that's what inspired me to become a historian and to become a researcher and a faculty member, because I learned that history is really a matter of perspectives. It's who writes the history, right? Who produces the knowledge matters a great deal, because what the data that you gather say and what it means can be very different, right? So I'll give you an example. After I finished my master's degree, I worked as a policy analyst. And there was a group that was working on a child care study for Hmong refugees in the Twin Cities. And one of their findings was that the reason Hmong women were going to get prenatal care, right, was because of their husband. And then they showed me some of the draft report to get feedback and said, there is no way this is true. Hmong men are not the reasons why their wives are getting prenatal care. When you really dig deep into the data and you interpret what it actually means, is that because many of the women didn't drive, so their husbands had to take them to their prenatal appointments. But that doesn't mean that it's because of their husbands that they're getting prenatal care. So sort of unpacking what data you gather and the cultural nuances, the cultural understandings, the community understanding is very important in terms of interpreting the data that you collect. So that's what kind of inspires me to be a researcher, to produce knowledge, to contribute to keeping Hmong experiences documented and alive. So that's why I travel all over the world to interview people like you're interviewing me, to make sure that our oral history tradition doesn't remain just oral history, that if it's not documented, our migration a couple hundred years ago from China wasn't documented, right? And so there isn't, we don't know what happened, how people felt when they crossed certain, villages in town, in mountains, the tragedies, the things that you've asked me, we don't know because it wasn't written down, or it wasn't documented. But our migration from Laos to the United States in the last 40 years has been more documented by non-Hmong people as well as Hmong people ourselves. So I just went to a research trip in French Guiana. A small group of Hmong were sent there in 1977, and very few people have studied them. And as I am interviewing all these people, I've inspired many of them to say, "Oh, we know all these experiences." I asked them, "Oh, did you write all these things down?" "Oh, we never thought about doing that. We keep telling our children, but they're not interested." So not all people are interested in producing knowledge or documenting people's experiences, but I, as a scholar, I think it's really important for me to do this because I can.
So you said that. I'll skip to the next question. How do you think have you ever seen anything about Hmong people in Western media that was like affecting the image of Hmong people?
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a good question because, in fact, that's all most people learn about Hmong people is through these really hyper visible, tragedies, right? And as most news, only bad news usually make the good news, especially for many communities of color in urban America and in other parts of the world too. But what I have seen is that, we have good news all the time, but good news, don't often make it to the front page. So it's bad news that get people all roused up. And so of course, since Hmong began coming to this country, it's always been these negative portrayals. So that's one of the things that, makes me want to do the kind of work I'm doing, is that, yes, I don't want the newspaper articles to be the only ways in which people learn about Hmong experiences. Just because, you've heard about the hunting shooting in northern Wisconsin in 2005, and then other shooting and other incidents after that. And you only hear about things like that. You hear about people killing each other. You hear about these backward Hmong traditions of early marriage. Those things make the newspaper. So for me, it's very important to acknowledge these tragedies that exist. But then I think it's very important to also lift all the assets and important things that the community is doing that helps them to thrive and helps to lift the larger community. I'll give you some example. There are particular places in Minnesota and here in Wisconsin too, where if there were no Hmong children, how many teachers would be out of jobs? Like, people critique Hmong families and how they're, uncontrollable and they have so many kids. You take those kids outside of this Wausau school district and you tell me how many of those teachers would be out of jobs, right? In places in like Tracy, Minnesota, small town America, if Hmong hadn't moved there, or in places in the Twin Cities in California, Wisconsin, wherever, you take those immigrant kids out, some of those schools would be closed down. So Hmong have impacted, the societies in which they live in ways that in more ways than sometimes those societies give back to them. But you don't read about these things. Non-Hmong people who don't live amongst Hmong people only hear of them through media representation, or through how their really the representations of their culture, the awkwardness of their traditions. That's really all you hear about Hmong people. So to me, my job isn't really to change, people who, no matter how much you tell them, they're not going to change the ways in which they view certain people. I mean, I have white American students who tell me that, when they were growing up, their parents or grandparents used to be so the bigots. They say all kinds of things about Hmong people. Oh yeah, those people eat dogs. Be careful of your dogs, right? Where did this come from, right? And so these young people grew up having all kinds of prejudice or stereotypes about Hmong. But you know what? None of them have ever really known a Hmong person personally. So it's all these stereotypes that we as a society or as people have about the other. And if you don't take the time, or if you refuse to take the time to really understand what the other is about, those people, they're going to hold their views no matter what. Okay? So to me, if people refuse to change, I'm not going to go out of my way. But if people are genuinely interested in learning how, as human beings, how we all have a lot of things in common, no matter where I go in the world, regardless of what color, what racial, ethnic background people are, we all have the same dreams. We want our children to be safe. We want our families to be safe. And we all want our children to have opportunities, regardless of where you go. I mean, I could be in Hanoi, Vietnam, and I'll see young people, they care about the same things that students here in Milwaukee care about. Their mopeds, their cell phone, and how much money they want to make. I mean, we're all so similar in so many ways, regardless of where you go in the world. So, yes, so the media is really all people have ever used. So, I think that's why I do the kind of work that I do, is to kind of tell some of these stories from an insider perspective, that sometimes it's hard as an outsider to really understand the cultural nuances in people's lived experiences. I mean, until you really live that same kind of or similar experience, it's hard to understand, right? So I think one of the interesting thing about your question earlier about how Hmong people have friends, I mean their family. One thing I do want to say is that even though what I am very thankful about is that even though I'm not so Hmong in the ways in which you would think a Hmong person should be, or the stereotypes of what Hmong women should be like. I travel all the time. I'm gone for weeks and months, and sometimes, my husband's Hmong, and sometimes people always ask me, "Oh, is your husband must not be Hmong because you're doing all these things." You see how much stereotypes people have? I say, "Oh no, I'm Hmong. My husband's Hmong. There are many Hmong women like me who are doing great things. You just don't know about them. So you think that we're all, sitting at home waiting for our husbands to come and we just cook for them." Those are stereotypes that people have about Hmong women, but they just don't know that there are hundreds of us doing. I'm not unique. I tell you, I'm not unique. I know so many friends who are out doing great things. But one thing that is very unique about Hmongness is that what I'm thankful about, and you asked about my children, which I hope they do improve their Hmong language, is that my ability to speak Hmong fluently is what has helped me to enter all kinds of Hmong space, meaning not here in the United States only, but all over the world. So I go to French Guiana, I go to, Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, and places in Europe. The fact that I am Hmong and I'm speaking Hmong to these elders, I'm not treated as an outsider. I'm just like a daughter to them, even though I have no relationship with them. But because I can engage with them, I can understand some of their life experiences through my own, background. I'm not an outsider. I'm always treated as a family member. because of the shared Hmong identity. But because I can speak Hmong to them, on my recent trip to French Guiana, 3 of the students speak, pretty decent Hmong for Hmong American-born Hmong children. One didn't as well. It was harder for him to engage with the elders there. All the Hmong youth, they all speak Hmong there because they're so isolated from everybody else. They live in their own village. They're not in, French Guianan society. They do interact with them too, but they're so isolated that everybody speaks Hmong. So if you go there and you don't speak Hmong, and if you don't speak French either, then it's harder to engage with them. So they embrace the ones who speak really good Hmong much more than the one who didn't.
It's like a barrier if you don't speak good Hmong.
Yeah.
That's how it is for us. Like when I go overseas to visit my family, I would have like an American accent, and then they would look at me like correcting my grammar and everything. But that helps me.
Yeah, but at least you are attempting to speak to them.
All right. Would you like to add anything else?
No, I just want to say that I'm so glad you're doing this project. I think the Washington Park is what you covered, right? Is it just that neighborhood?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I hope that you will interview many more Hmong people. And I know Professor Sen has asked me to, help sometimes if I have time. I'm interviewing a lot of people around town too for my own oral history project. So I think the more experiences you have, I think that would be great if you can interview. I know Ronsei is a little bit older than I am, but interviewing some young people, maybe even some of your peers on campus who live in that neighborhood, or there's many other Hmong there. And I don't know, you have a couple of Hmong students in your group, right? Do they speak Hmong well enough to interview?
We have one. Tommy.
Yeah, Tommy.
But, that's the only one. But yeah, he speaks really good Hmong.
Yeah, so interviewing some of the grandparents to see their their perspectives, I'm sure would be so rich for you to learn from them too, because some of us are younger and are we value different things. On my weekends I it's not about being selfish. Sometimes I used to think that I was selfish by focusing too much just on my little family, but it's just different values. Many Hmong who have a lot of relatives around would spend weekends, joining all the different festivities. But because my family isn't here, I can't always go to Minnesota every weekend to join their events. So my weekends are more for my family. And so the things that we do, of course, will be very different. My sister lives in California, and her husband's family is all there, right? So they have lots of relatives. Every weekend, she's out eating at someone's house because they have all kinds of celebrations. I don't as much here because my family isn't here. If they were here, I would weigh more, because I would get more free food on weekends. But since I have to cook for myself, I don't eat as much. So I hope that helps a little bit. I like to ramble on and on, but I hope it's helpful to you.
It really is helpful. Anything is helpful. So that's why we're here, so we can document what you have to say. Like you said before, there isn't really anybody to document these stories and everything. So that's what we're going to do. So.
Good. Yep.
Well, if I can help in other ways, just let me know.
All right. Thank you. It was really nice
Sure.
meeting you.
Same here.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet